Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the session on the quality of teaching and learning in higher education. I wonder how many of you were as innocent as I was 5 years ago before my colleagues and I embarked on the large empirical national study which Rowena mentioned. Having been at the same university for 56 years, having had 4 children, all of whom went to a standard liberal arts college, I blithely, though erroneously, assumed that my experience was the dominant experience in the country. I thought private rather than public, selective rather than non-selective, liberal arts rather than vocational or sheer distribution, graduation rather than dropout. As a result of this study, which I hope someday to be able to report here at the Philosophical Society, I've lost my innocence. I now realize we have about 7,000 institutes of higher education, at least half of them for profit, that upwards of 80% of students go to public institutions, that many students who go to non-selective schools never graduate, though they may accumulate considerable credits and more than considerable debt, that most individuals on most campuses do not know what liberal arts means, or think it has a political rather than epistemological or administrative meaning. And indeed, as some of you will recently have read, if you give 2 groups of subjects the identical description of a curriculum and include the word liberal arts in one and not in the other, those who encounter the term liberal arts will evaluate the curriculum less favorably. Moreover, in a number of studies that have recently appeared, many, if not a majority of Americans, and certainly a majority of conservatively leaning respondents, think that higher education does a disservice to the country, or at least does little good. That said, most Americans still aspire to higher education, or at least to the experience of going away or commuting to an institution of higher learning. But what that means differs enormously across demographies and across campuses. Speaking bluntly, many, if not most, of those who attend community colleges need remedial work that should have been covered in secondary school rather than college, even though the term remedial has now become politically unacceptable. And even in more selective schools, where most of us work, it's often difficult to demonstrate to a skeptic that the bulk of students have learned to think differently, more deeply, let alone in a transformed way. Rather, as a controversial book recently asserted, these students are academically adrift. We academics like to study ourselves. As I learned, there are thousands and thousands of empirical studies of higher education, summarized every decade or so in a huge compendium, first edited by Ernest Pasquarella and Patrick Terenzini, and recently updated by Matthew Mayhew and colleagues. It is a weighty collection in every sense of that descriptor. And yet, truth be told, there is still little agreement about how best to teach difficult materials to today's diverse student body, how to assess what students are learning, and what they should be learning in a 4-year education that's not strictly vocational. And that, I believe, is a central theme of today's important symposium. Now, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce the organizer of the symposium, Mike McPherson, a friend and colleague of many years, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. Mike is without doubt one of the leading experts in higher education in the country. Mike was educated at the University of Chicago. While some of us were getting ready for our bar mitzvahs, not just Bob Hauser yesterday, Mike was already studying mathematics at the U of C, and then economics. He would then, after getting his doctorate, move to Williams College, where he taught economics, chaired the department, and then became the dean. For 7 years, he was president of Macalester College, and then he became president of the Spencer Foundation. That's the leading foundation that supports research in education. Indeed, it often appears it's the only foundation that supports research in education, and several of us here, including, of course, Pat Graham, have been involved with the Spencer Foundation for many years. In Mike's case, 13 plus years. He tried to retire. They wouldn't let him, so he stayed a bit longer. Mike ostensibly retired last year, but now he's kept very busy working at numerous national organizations in Washington, D.C., New York, Cambridge, and probably elsewhere as well. Most important, Mike continues to research and write on the economics of education, philosophical issues about education, and how to maintain and revitalize the educational system and sector in our country from preschool through higher education and beyond. Mike will introduce the rest of the symposium. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that very generous introduction, Howard. And it's always good to precede your talk by having a strong reminder of how astonishingly capable and qualified the audience is by hearing these inductions. I will refer to a Nobel laureate, but it won't be to me. And it won't, unfortunately, be to Kip Thorne either. But I'm very happy to be able to make the opening remarks for this symposium. I'm not going to try to introduce all the people you will hear from at this point. We'll talk about that later. The basic plan for the morning is that I will give these remarks. Then we are so fortunate to have with us as a moderator for the rest of the morning Emily Hanford, who is a very talented journalist with American Public Media and is the producer on public radio of the Educate podcast and frequent documentaries about education. So further introductions will be forthcoming at a later point. For now, I want to bring us into the substance of the morning's questions, and there will be more questions than answers, I assure you. I got more engaged with the topic we're going to talk about, which is the prospects for improving teaching in American higher education, through being the co-chair of a commission on undergraduate education, along with Roger Ferguson of TIAA, that agreed to address the question of the future of undergraduate education in the United States, broadly considered, recognizing the breadth of what constitutes higher education in the United States at this point. A great, almost mind-boggling variety of types of institutions, very difficult to take on, but we thought it was important for people to be able to think about this large spread of institutions as a whole. And we assembled a wonderful set of commission members, and I'm happy to say that with support from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which organized this commission, we'll have a report around the end of the month. I'm not going to preview the report because I think the president of the Academy, Jonathan Fanton, would be less than pleased if I announced the results of the Academy study to APS before I announced them to the Academy. I can say, though, that something we learned quickly on our commission is that it was really important to address the quality of the educational experiences students were obtaining, helping to produce in the wide variety of institutions where they found themselves. Historically, at the national level, the main national concern about higher education has been expanding participation. The history of American higher education is a history of including groups that had been excluded, largely or completely: African Americans, women, people who couldn't afford to pay for college. And that march forward has been, in many ways, a very big success story. And we shouldn't forget that. These people who are in community colleges in this generation have parents who wouldn't have had a prayer of any kind of college experience a generation before. It's now true that about 2/3 of high school graduates start some form of post-secondary education within a year of their graduation from high school. And by age 30, almost 90% of high school graduates have begun post-secondary education somewhere. Now, I'm an expert in this area, supposedly, but that figure stunned me. That is a tremendous amount of access, not complete, but a tremendous amount of progress in giving young people and older people access to higher education. So now the national problem, as Howard was intimating in his remarks, has to shift to a significant degree from questions of quantity to questions of quality. We know to begin with that a great many students don't complete the programs that they start, a problem that's especially endemic among disadvantaged populations and among first-generation college students. It's not surprising that would be where the struggle lies. But there's more to higher education than putting a couple of letters after your name, whether they're AA or BA or even PhD. It's important that people become equipped for the life after college and the work after college. We need to think about how are people going to shape careers and how are they going to contribute to our governmental and civic institutions and how are they going to lead satisfying lives. And that doesn't depend just on checking a box or getting a diploma. It depends on what happened while you were in college. And that leads directly to trying to investigate and reflect on the quality of the undergraduate experience in this variety of places. Now, as I begin to talk about these questions of quality, and especially of the classroom experience in American higher education, I have to generalize. And I'm strongly aware that I am probably looking at a room full of exceptions. So just keep in mind, you all are really exceptional. And so my averaged comments won't necessarily always apply. But I'll try to take into account the variation as well as the averages. The fact is that for a substantial majority, it would be fair to say most faculty members in American higher education, their main, even defining activity is undergraduate teaching. That's not true of the teachers and professors and emeritus in those categories in this room for the most part. You've been at the top research universities where the largest amount of your time has probably gone to scholarship and research in graduate education. But nationally, over 50% of the time of faculty members is spent on undergraduate teaching, while about 11% is spent on graduate teaching and 11% on research. So it's by far the majority of time and energy going into undergraduate teaching. That's about 70% of their professional time. I believe the rest, the other 30%, is divided between time served on committees and time spent complaining about service on committees. And again, this varies widely from 70% of time or more on teaching at community colleges to research, to leading research universities where research and graduate education predominate in their activities. But the bulk of the work is undergraduate teaching at both four-year institutions, including the vast variety of less selective and non-selective four-year public institutions around this large country. That's where the action is. But when you begin to examine where colleges and universities put their attention and into how faculty understand their own lives and roles, it really doesn't look like the idea of delivering strong and improving instruction for undergraduates stands out on the whole. Certainly, graduate training does not focus on preparing students for a teaching career. That is, at best, a minor afterthought in most graduate programs. The professional identities of faculty, even at places where not that much research work actually gets done, the professional identity tends to be tied to the scholar researcher and tied to the discipline in which they work rather than the institution in fulfilling the teaching mission. And the professional futures of academics, again, even at places which are not prominent research institutions, often depends more on their scholarly success than on what, in terms of their time and in terms of their social function, is their major occupation. Now, for administrators, even at places where undergraduate teaching predominates, there's little evidence of efforts to bring focused attention to the strengths and weaknesses of faculty's performance as teachers, either as individuals or on the whole. There's not much attention or resources to helping faculty systematically improve their classroom work. And certainly few institutions make teaching quality a high priority in hiring, in retention, in promotion. So the sense I come away with, definitely with significant exceptions, is of a profession and an industry that seems more or less indifferent to the quality of instruction that faculty provide. Now, that's a pretty strong claim. Let me qualify it in a couple of significant respects. One is the exceptions. There are many small colleges, including many, but I would not necessarily say all, liberal arts colleges, which assign a much higher priority to higher quality teaching. And there are certainly many individual teachers who take their craft seriously and work at improvement, although they do tend to work on it on a kind of cottage industry basis of each person figuring it out for themselves. Secondly, colleges and universities do assess faculty, including part-timers, pretty carefully for their subject matter competence. And subject matter competence is plainly a prerequisite to good teaching, but it is clearly also not a sufficient condition for good teaching, as anybody who has spent much time at professional associations listening to faculty make presentations would have to acknowledge. And I do not accept economists from that diagnosis. Finally, many places now have teaching and learning centers that are in place to try to improve people's teaching. Some of these are quite serious places, and there's interesting work that gets done in some cases. But by the nature of their assignment, they tend to range over the entire curriculum, the entire set of specialties. And that limits the kind of help they can give to generic forms of teaching improvement, which may range from don't turn your back to the class when you write on the blackboard, to more general kinds of things like preferring active teaching to passive teaching, which generally means discussion versus lecture or something of that kind. These are not trivial, but they are limited in how far they can go. The great theorist, psychologist and theorist of education, Lee Shulman, long ago coined a term called pedagogical content knowledge. And he suggested there are really three kinds of knowledge that a teacher at any level has to have. One is, teachers got to be teaching something, and they have to know about that something. So content knowledge, absolutely required. General pedagogical knowledge, as I was just illustrating, is important to successful teaching. In K-12, that's classroom management, making sure that you can hold the class's attention and things of that kind. But the third, pedagogical content knowledge, is how do you teach that thing? How do you teach the economics to introductory students, how do you enable students in history to learn to think like historians? That is a specialized form of knowledge, and it's impossible for a teaching and learning center to house people who are experts on all of those fields. So there are some efforts toward quality, but on the whole, I would describe the outlook on undergraduate teaching and its improvement as relaxed. And that's hardly new. I think it's been the case for a long time. I think at one time it might have been viewed as a kind of benign neglect. The view being that we're all professionals here, those of us on the faculty. We know what we're doing. And because we are in the job of enabling you to learn, you don't know what we're doing. You don't even know what you're doing. We're teaching you. And you can trust us to do a good job. Well, as Howard said, that assumption of trust is looking a little shaky these days. We know that in general, institutions of long standing have lost a great deal of trust. There's just tremendous mistrust, which Howard has written and thought about extensively. So that's part of the issue. Another part of it is that the stakes in higher education are higher than ever. They're high certainly in terms of the knowledge people have that employment and income are tightly tied to how much education you get. So there's a lot of anxiety about people being able to get this and of it being worth their time and their increasing amounts of money to get it. But more broadly, those of us who are thinking broadly about higher education see it as an important lever in helping overcome the political divisions that are so difficult in this society and in helping people to find their way to more productive relationships among one another, inside and outside of the workplace. So that's one big reason why we can't just assume everything's fine. But a second reason is that most of that teaching of undergraduates is no longer provided by those trusted professionals that I was referring to. This is a truly ugly neologism, but the so-called adjunctification of the faculty is well advanced. Now, it's a problem that we don't have any name for people who are not on the tenure track that doesn't sound vaguely derisive. So adjuncts, contingent, non-tenure track. This is a large fraction of people now. As long ago as 10 years ago, about 2/3 of all undergraduate teaching was provided by adjuncts, contingent faculty, or non-tenure track. 2/3 in the nation as a whole. And although it's most prevalent in community colleges, it is very much part of the scene in universities, and particularly public universities, but also private universities, and even in liberal arts colleges, although to certainly a lesser degree. The evidence is that this share is rising. And this 2/3 does not include graduate teaching assistants in big courses. These are people who have their own courses. There is this case of a person in Minnesota, where I used to live, who majored in economics at the University of Minnesota and graduated without ever having had a course from a member of the University of Minnesota economics faculty. This is not a look that inspires trust. Now, a number of factors have contributed to this really very strong trend. It's not been a centrally planned kind of conspiracy. I mean, universities aren't really capable of centrally planned conspiracies. And often they don't even know exactly how many people are in these roles or who they are. Certainly the oversupply of PhDs in some fields creates markets of cheap labor. and that's an important factor. It's still true that most people, outside of a few disciplines like computer science, where the opportunities outside the academy are very strong, most people get PhDs because they want to be professors. And most of them, many of them no longer have the prospect of getting a regular faculty job. The decentralized hiring of release time replacements, I think, is an original source of a lot of this. Way back when I was at Williams, I remember that if somebody became a chair or got a grant, you could be released from your teaching, but you had to find a substitute. And for all of Williams' vaunted reputation, man, we took anybody who could say the word economics. And I think that's just a realistic way that folks have behaved. And of course, the financial pressures that especially public higher education has endured have made it more difficult and more risky to create tenure-track positions and to pay for them. And I would add that uncapping retirement has made tenure riskier for universities. You don't know how long that commitment is, and if people stay longer, there are fewer openings. So, now, of course, there's plenty of variation in circumstances. There are some places where lecturers have quite stable employment and are in a position to do really good work. Many different circumstances lead people to become adjuncts. Some are retired people. Some are people coming from industry who have particular skills that are valued. On the whole, though, what's true about the adjuncts of the world is that their positions are precarious, they're poorly paid, they lack benefits in most cases, and they are subject to poor working conditions. Not having an office, so Starbucks becomes your place to see students. Not having any security from one term to the next of what you'll be asked to do. Sometimes told a day before the semester will start that we don't need you. This does not conduce to careful preparation of courses, needless to say. And I think very importantly, people who are in these adjunct positions generally have virtually no voice in how their institutions function. And these are people who regard themselves as professionals. Many of them have PhDs from good places, and they have opinions, and nobody wants to listen. And I think that's a real humiliation that adds to the burden. Needless to say, the spectacular growth of this workforce is very hard to claim as a form of benign neglect. Now, this is one of the things that's put pressure on higher education, and the pressures are quite real, and higher education has not been silent or entirely passive in responding to the pressures. So there's been a movement toward outcome measurement and accountability. This, as Howard mentioned, this tends to take the form of measuring certain generic outcomes of higher education, like how much does critical thinking improve, or more commonly, how much do earnings improve if you are a college graduate. These kinds of measures can be useful for some purposes, probably especially for consumers trying to select a college. If you know something about those facts about a college, or factoids at least, that may influence your choices, or about legislators deciding where to spend money. But there's one thing these measures can't do. They can't help colleges improve. You know, imagine I'm at McAllister and Steve Lewis is back at Carleton as president, and quite contrary to fact, a report comes out saying that McAllister students are worse at critical thinking than Carleton students. Just imagine, I mean, it's not true, but imagine. So I read that fact. What am I supposed to do about it? Where in this institution is the failure to produce critical thinkers happening? And what dials might the institution turn to change that? The fact is, we're standing completely outside of the institution and looking at it from that point of view, and it gives us no clue about the processes by which critical thinking capability or the ability to think like an economist is produced. You know, it's the familiar challenge of getting inside of the black box. And it seems to me if we're going to be credible as an industry, and I think I'm determinedly using that word because that's how we are judged and seen, I think more attention to and transparency about how teaching and its improvement are supported could be an important response to the challenges we face. There are also important positive reasons for a focus on improved teaching. At its best, higher education can help people achieve these major life goals, and not just narrow job skills that will quickly become obsolete, but the kind of flexibility, problem-solving ability, especially communication across difference that our society so much needs, both for individual life success and a healthier society. We want to learn more about how the instructional practices we engage in can help promote achieving those kinds of ambitious goals, and how teaching can more reliably enable students to make progress on these goals. So it seems to me that this is an important thing to consider, and that big workforce of non-tenure track people can become an asset in addressing these questions rather than one of the liabilities that drags us down. Here you have a lot of people who are doing this because they want to be teachers, want to be professionals, even though they're being treated terribly in many cases, and would be quite responsive to initiatives that regular faculty might well resist. You know, being more open to trying new things in the classroom, more willing to devote time and energy to learning improved techniques, and to sharing among themselves what seems more effective and seems less effective, and more amenable to the kind of closer observation of their classroom work that could allow us to understand teaching and learning better. It seems to me that there's at least as good a chance of improved teaching spreading from the adjunct faculty to the regular faculty than the other way around. And I think there's a long-run opportunity to leverage that insight, which I think is well worth our pursuit.